All right, good evening. It's time for us to go ahead and get into our study as we are working our way right now through the Old Testament. And as we have done so last week, we introduced the number 3 key passage of the Old Testament. So let's make sure that we remember what those key passages are. Remember, it's a given. Genesis chapters 1 and 2, creation, that's given. As far as understanding, there's a story in place to get us from Genesis 1 and 2 back to Revelation chapter 22 or 21 and 22. So that being the case, what then are the key passages of the Old Testament that we are familiar with already? All right, so it starts, the first one is, whoa. There it is. All right, first one is Genesis chapter 3. And what happens in Genesis 3? All right, you have the fall. What's the next one? All right, very good. Genesis chapter 12. And what happens in Genesis 12? All right, the promises to Abraham. And then last week, which one did we introduce? All right, Exodus 24. And what happens in Exodus 24? All right, very good. They enter into their covenant. And so we talked about that, and that was reiterated. Mike talked about that this morning with the blood of the covenant, the sprinkling of the blood on the altar, the sprinkling of the blood on the people. What did that accomplish? What was the point of the sprinkling of the blood? Yeah, it was signing the contract, basically. Each party signed the agreement that all that the Lord has spoken we will do, we will be obedient. God promises to be their God, to take care of them. And did they do a really good job with that? How long did it take before they already violated the terms of this covenant? All right, within the time period of 40 days as Moses is up on the mountain, they put gold in a thing and out pops a golden calf, right? And they worship this thing as what? What did Aaron say? All right, behold, Israel, your God, or gods, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So they were worshiping Yahweh, but this is a violation of which command? All right, out of the top 10, this is number 2, right? Don't make an idol out of any image, which is exactly what they're doing. So that's Exodus chapter 32. Chapter 34, after Moses has intervened, 34, this is where God renews the covenant again with them, a new set of tablets. Remember, Moses had come down with the set of tablets. By the way, why were there 2 tablets? All right, because there were one for each party of the contract, right? Each party gets a set of the contract papers. And so Israel keeps one, the other one goes into the ark. So he, though, comes down from the mountain. What does he do with them? Moses? He breaks them. That's right, Joshua. Why does he break them? These are important things. God himself had made these. Why does Moses come down and slam them on the ground and break them? Okay, because he's angry that they did what? What has Israel done? They violated the covenant. Use another word for me. They broke the covenant, right? So Moses breaks the covenant tablets. That's the way that we would take a contract and rip it up, saying this contract is now null and void. It's been broken. So God then in Exodus 34, a new set of covenant tablets. And they are once again put on there, reinstated, and God promises to go with them. All of this is taking place at Mount Sinai, which we don't know exactly where Mount Sinai is. The general place that people assume is around in there. This is the Sinai Peninsula, in case you're thinking I wrote an M for some reason. It's around in there. I've heard a good reason why it might be over here in Midian. There are a couple different spots in the Sinai Peninsula that people think that it is. We just don't know exactly where Mount Sinai is, or Horeb, or the mountain of God, goes by those various names. But while they are there, what do they do to end the book of Exodus? What do they do in the last chapters, 35 through 40? Exodus 35 through 40. All right, they build the tabernacle. Why? All right, because God's moving in. They build him a place where he can come and live with them in the center of their camp. All right, so that concludes Exodus. We move into Leviticus and half of Numbers. All of this takes place at Mount Sinai. They're going to be here for a lot of the Pentateuch, or what we call the Law of Moses. And so as you get into Leviticus, he starts giving them their laws about what? What types of things do you find in Leviticus? Leviticus.
Laws about sacrifices, about special days.
About things that can touch and can't touch.
Okay, all right. Laws about sacrifices. All right, there are special days, feasts, festivals, various things like that. Laws concerning what group of people in particular?
Levites.
All right, the Levites and the priests, the job of the high priests, and everything involved in there. Really, a lot of it leads up to Leviticus chapter 16. What happens in Leviticus chapter 16? What is that? Instructions concerning? All right, the Day of Atonement. This is the holiest day in the year. This is the day in which sacrifices are made. We talked about this in the Hebrews class, for those of you who were able to be a part of that they would sacrifice an animal, and then the high priest would take the blood of that animal into the tabernacle and do what with it? Sprinkle it on all the pieces inside the tabernacle. Why? Seems a little odd, doesn't it? What's that? Yeah, this is blood cleanses. This is a purification ceremony. It's cleansing the tabernacle, because the tabernacle, all the pieces of the tabernacle, including the Ark of the Covenant, it needs to be cleansed from sinfulness. Why would the tabernacle need to be cleansed from sinfulness? Are people going inside the tabernacle to commit sins? Okay, to take away sins, yeah, but no sin really happens in the tabernacle. Why does it need to be cleaned? You guys remember this discussion from the Hebrews class? Someone should remember this, right? All right, because the tabernacle is sitting in the middle of a sinful people. And sin is like this gaseous, noxious, just horrible filth that's there, and it leaves a residue all over everything. And so the tabernacle, even though no sin is taking place in the tabernacle needs to be purified, needs to be cleansed with blood so that it can become clean. And then what happens to that great cloud of sinfulness to make sure that it doesn't keep infecting the tabernacle? What happens to it? All right, there's 2 other goats that are chosen. One becomes a sacrifice, and the other one becomes what some translations call it the scapegoat. There are other translations for it. It's a weird word. Anyway, the idea is that when the high priest puts his head or his hands on the head of the goat, it's like he's attaching the sinfulness of the camp and sends the goat outside the camp into the wilderness so that it kind of takes all that sin junk away and cleanses and purifies the people. Which means they should be good to go, right? Except what? Except they sin again. So this is a process that needs to be repeated on an annual basis, every year. There's no conclusion to it. It has to be done again and again because sinfulness takes place again and again. Impurity takes place again and again because they are called to be a holy people. And we talked about that last week, right? The idea that they are a priest to all the other nations, or a couple weeks ago, whenever that was. So they have to have a holiness about them that makes them different, that sets them apart from the rest. They have to be pure as a people. Now, in the midst of this is also a whole bunch of moral laws. It's not just arbitrary laws concerning how to be pure as a people, but you also have a lot of just laws concerning morality, how to live, sexual sins and problems and things that need to be dealt with, not engaging in things such as witchcraft and the occult and things like that. In the midst of this, Leviticus chapter, I'm going to mix this up, chapter 19, Leviticus chapter 19, you have one of the more well-known verses of the Bible, even if people oftentimes don't recognize where it's from. What is said in Leviticus chapter 19 that is really, really important? You might find it around verse 18. Unless I flip those, then you're going to be really confused. All right. Was there anything in there that sounds really, really important? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The second of the great commandments comes out of Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 19. And it doesn't even have its own verse. It's just kind of tucked away in the midst of something else. But this is where it comes from. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, right there. Leviticus chapter 19, 18b is how I would usually describe that. So you have Leviticus, and then you get into the book of Numbers. And why do they call the book of Numbers Numbers? Okay, because they count the people. It starts off with a bunch of numbers, and there's a lot of them. And it lists off numbers of the various families within the tribes and how many. It's really boring reading as you're reading through this. It's just, this number, these many people, this number, these many. It just goes on and on. Well, what's the purpose of the numbers, though? What are they numbering? Okay, people, but even more, Serena? Okay, the numbering is the numbering of the fighting men. Men who are over the age of 20 and are able to go into battle. Why does that matter? Why would they want to count those people?
They're about to take over the land that they want there.
What's that, Serena?
They're about to take over the land of that's been promised to them.
Yeah, they've got this land up here. This is what God has promised to them. And he's about ready to take them up so that they can go into battle. And so they're doing standard preparatory battle work. They're numbering the fighting men and setting them apart from the rest so that they are ready to engage in battle. So after they number the people, God takes them up, and they finally leave Mount Sinai. So we've been here, right, from Exodus chapter 19. Now we're finally, about midway through Numbers, we're finally leaving, and we're going up to a place about right here called Kadesh Barnea. So you come to Kadesh Barnea, and before they take the land, they could just run right up and take it at this point. Before they do that, what does God have them do? We're in Numbers chapter 13 now. This is a familiar story, though. I think many of you probably remember this one. What does God have them do? Okay. All right. He has them send spies up into Canaan. How many? 12, one for each tribe. And how long do they stay up there? Somebody said it. All right, 40 days. So they go up, they come back after 40 days, and all the people gather together, and they give their report of the land in Numbers chapter 13. So, chapter 13, starting verse 25. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. They came to Moses and Aaron, to all the congregation, the people of Israel, in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them, to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey. This is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong. Their cities are fortified and very large, and besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb, or south. The Hittites and the Jebusites, the Amorites, dwell in the hill country. The Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." So, they come and they give a report. And first of all, they describe the land itself. Is the land what God had promised? Absolutely. Does it have the bountiful produce that they were told that it would have? Yes. How many people did it take to bring back a cluster of grapes?
14.
Well, it took 2 for the cluster, right? That they came back and they carried it. It was, it was a lot. This was a bountiful land, a land flowing with milk and honey, which is just a phrase that means it's a land that provides what we need. That's all that phrase means. Doesn't mean there's rivers of milk followed by rivers of honey somewhere. It just means the land has what we need to survive and to thrive. And they said, yeah, it's exactly what God said it was going to be. But what's the problem? Big people, yeah. They're like, there's no way we can take this land. They got cities with huge fortifications. There are giants that live there, to the point that when we looked at them, how did they compare themselves to the men who lived there? Yeah, they're like, we felt like grasshoppers in front of them. There's no way, no possible way that we could take this land. And so all of the spies gave what's called a bad report, right? Oh, wait, no, it wasn't all of them, was it? Yeah, you can almost see, like, they chose a spokesman, and the spokesman stands up, and he's like, this is great land, this is wonderful, and they're all like, yeah, and he's like, but there's no way we can do it, and then you have 2 people like, wait, what? You can almost see them being like, what are you talking about? Who are those 2 people? All right, Joshua, Caleb, right? Again, we know this story. We're familiar with this. We know what's going on here. And the two of them are like, you guys are crazy. Of course we can take it. Why? What's the problem? What's the difference between the others and Joshua and Caleb? Okay, Josie said Joshua and Caleb have faith in God. They don't look at the obstacles. They assume there are no obstacles because God's going to deal with the obstacles. Why in the world would they assume that God's going to deal with these obstacles? Yeah, hasn't he already shown the plagues in Egypt, brought them out of Egypt with a mighty hand, took them across the Red Sea on dry ground, and took out the army that was chasing them, defeated the Amalekites, already defeated them, and provided water for them, food, whatever they've come across, God's taken care of it. His track record is perfect so far. So of course he's going to do this. Well, they come back, and the people brought what's called a bad report for them. Who did they listen to? The people at large. Did they listen to the 2 optimistic ones or the 10 pessimistic ones?
10 pessimistic ones.
Yeah. Negativity just breeds more negativity. That's usually the way that it goes. People have a tendency to listen to the negative, especially if they are inclined to do so anyway, which is what we've seen again and again and again from these people. Yeah, Josie? Yep. See, Josie said, is the Hebrew word here, the bad report that's brought, is that the same word that's found in the story of Joseph when he brought a bad report concerning his brothers? And yes, it's the exact same word. There is a modifier here that you don't find in Genesis 37. So, this one has bad report, but it carries the same negative connotation, I think, in both places. So, very good observation. So here in Numbers, chapter 14, what do the people say? In verse 2, they cry out, they grumbled against Moses. By the way, a word, once again, that's associated very specifically with the Exodus generation. Almost every time that it's used for this group of people. So they grumble, and what do they say there in verse 2? All right, they say basically, it would be better to what? All right, to die in either Egypt or the wilderness than to what? All right, to go up and try to take this land that we're unable to take, die by the sword, have our women taken and our children forced into servanthood or become slaves. They say, oh, that we died in the land of Egypt or died in the wilderness instead of doing this. And eventually, what do they decide that they're going to do? Okay. They decide that they're going to choose a new leader. They're going to go back to Egypt. Again, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, Caleb, they're kind of, the 4 of them seem to be against everybody else. And they're saying, hey, this is great land. We should do this. Let us go. Verse 10. What's decided? Yeah. Let's just stone these guys, these leaders. Choose new leaders, and let's go back. This is when the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting for all of the people of Israel. So God now intervenes at this point. God is angry, it seems. He is upset, and he comes in, and what does he want to do? What? Yeah. Well, I'm just going to give them a plague, let me, deal with them with pestilence, disinherit them. I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. Does this sound familiar in any way? Where have we heard this kind of language before? Exodus 32. This is the same scenario by which Israel violates their covenant relationship. God says, you know what? They violated it, it's broken. I'm not going to completely throw it aside. I'm not going to wipe everyone out. I'm just going to kind of bring it back to one man and start it all over again. And who intercedes? The same way that he interceded before? All right, Moses. And he has a lot of the same things to say, right? He says, look, the Egyptians are going to hear about this, which is what he said back in Exodus chapter 32. And they say will say it's because, verse 16, the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land that he swore to give them and killed them in the wilderness. It's going to be something that is going to cause God's reputation to be decreased. But look at verse 18. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. He will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third, the fourth generation. So please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. Where does that come from? Yeah, is he not, at this moment, taking God's words in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, and saying to God, this is who you are. This is what you have claimed to be. And now are you going to deny this? He's taking God's own words and using them, putting them back in God's face and saying, remember what it is that you have said. This is how you act. And how does God respond? Yeah, he says, I have pardoned them according to your word. So everything's great, right? They're pardoned. What does a pardon mean? It means they're forgiven. Everything's forgiven. Everything's forgotten at this point. So now they can just move on from Sinai. I'm sorry, they're not in Sinai. Kadesh. Now they can just move on and fulfill what they were supposed to do, right? They've been pardoned. Is that right?
Still consequences.
Yeah. Serena, hold on just a second. Let the mic get there. Go ahead.
Oftentimes with our kids, they do something wrong. We forgive them, but they still have to suffer their consequences. God forgave the children of Israel. They still had to suffer their consequences.
Okay. All right. So there are still consequences, yes, to be suffered. But these consequences, though, are punishment, are they not? I mean, this isn't a natural consequence that God is going to choose. He could have, without violating anything, he could have said, okay, that's fine, I will take you into the land. Instead, though, what does he choose to do? Okay, instead, they're going to wander for 40 years. Why 40? A year for each day that they spent in the land, spying the land, right? They spent 40 days, so 40 years, a year for each day. So he says they're going to do this until what happens? Sorry, Aaron, say that again. Okay, until that generation of fighters, everyone over the age of 20, right? Until they die in the wilderness. And so over the age of 20 or 20 years old and upward, I think is what it is, 20 years old and upward, until they all die. Why is he going to have them die in the wilderness? Because that's what they asked for. They said, we would rather die in Egypt or die in the wilderness instead of go up here. And God says, I can do that. I mean, if that's your druthers, then I'm fine with that. Yeah, we'll just wander for 40 years. And in that 40-year period of time, all of you who wanted to die in the wilderness instead of going up and fight, I'll accommodate that. We can do that. But why just those people? Why not the people who were under the age of 20? Is it because there's no, the age of accountability is 20, and once you hit 20, then you are accountable for your sins, but you're not accountable for sins under the age of 20? Okay, fighting men, yeah, but that seems arbitrary. Why choose that? Yeah, but people under the age of 20 saw the signs and wonders. Josie said it's because they saw the signs and wonders. But people under the age of 20, they also saw the signs and wonders, walked across the Red Sea on dry ground, right? They would be the people to go into the land that was promised. Well, everyone under the age of 20 is also going to go into the land that was promised, right? Why these people? I mean, I have heard people say it's because you're not accountable until you get to the age of 20. And that's why it is. And so decisions made underneath that. I don't think that's the case at all. Kelly?
Did they not have a say in society until they were 20, so it's not their fault?
I think that's exactly what it is. The people who were numbered and set out and chosen to make this decision, the ones who refuse to go up into the land are the ones who are 20 years old and upward. And all the ones that were under that, they did not have a say in this. They weren't part of that decision. And so it's those who made the decision. They're the ones who are going to wander for the 40-year period of time, and they will all die out in the wilderness. So if God pardoned them, why is he still punishing them? What do you guys think of this one? Because this one's a little bit of a conundrum, isn't it? He says you're pardoned. And then he says, but you're punished. Thoughts? Okay, say that louder. What'd you say? All right, still need to learn the consequences of their actions. It's kind of what Serena said earlier, but is this a natural consequence? I mean, it's different from somebody who makes a poor decision and then they reap the end of that poor decision, just a natural thing. If you get verschnickered and you get behind the wheel of a car and you crash into a tree because your faculties weren't good enough, that's a consequence of your action. This is a punishment that is given. We got a couple hands, so I'll make you walk the furthest, just because that's fun to do to Kelly. So Julia, yeah.
Could it have something to do with the fact that the people themselves didn't ask for forgiveness, and it was Moses who begged for them to be pardoned on their behalf?
Okay, all right. Very well could be. That there is something to the mediator aspect of that. Serena?
I like the backwards walking. Not natural consequences, but they had to learn from their bad choices, and sometimes other people learn from other people's bad choices as well. The people who didn't make the decision would know why they were wandering in the wilderness and why they had to wander in the wilderness for those 40 years as well. And they would also learn that, these people didn't trust God. That's why we didn't get to go in then. We need to trust God so that we can go in when this 40-year period is over.
Okay.
So it's kind of a broader lesson
Yeah.
for God's people that God's handing out.
And they do become exemplary in just that way, that the Exodus generation is mentioned over and over throughout Scripture, even into the New Testament. We talked about it extensively, didn't we, in the Hebrews class? As a don't be like these kinds of people. Look at what happened to them in the wilderness. So absolutely, the example that's given is certainly an aspect of it.
Because during this time, God also, their clothes didn't wear out, their sandals didn't wear out. He made sure they had food. So there was a broader lesson that happened during these 40 years that helped them to trust Him more when they then were able to go in.
Yeah, and you have that reminder there in Deuteronomy about how God, yes, while they were in their punishment, God was still full of grace towards them, miraculously so. I think it's just, oh, go ahead, Kelly.
Is it a nod to their free will as long as they're not, that's what they wanted.
Yeah.
They didn't want to do what He wanted. They wanted to do what they wanted. He let them.
Mm-hmm.
And when they figured out, wait a second, so the option was we're all going to die now, or we're going to die in the wilderness, or now we're going in. And He said no.
Right.
No, you don't get to have your free will in direct opposition to me and still get what you want.
Yes. Yeah.
You can have the first thing you wanted.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that too. That's why I wanted to try to make sure that we saw this wasn't arbitrary on God's part. He wasn't just random and said, well, you know what, you're just going to die in the wilderness. He's giving them exactly what they asked for. This is what they wanted. We'd rather die in the wilderness than do this. And God says, okay, I will give you that. I think it's also important to remember that we are dealing with terms and ideas that in our language, in our time, the way that we think of things, we put certain baggage and certain understandings and ideas on them. When we say the word pardon, we immediately think of a judge who stands before the people, says, you are pardoned, and they get to stand up and walk out and no problems at all. That's not necessarily the way that this works in society in ancient times, the way that God works with His people. A pardon does not necessarily mean that everyone is just perfectly good. You're good to go, take off, you're fine, no big deal. Quite often, when God forgives, there's also some kind of penalty that is tied to it still, for probably all the various reasons that y'all have been saying. But it's important that we understand we're dealing with terminology and we're thinking about it in our language, our culture, our way of understanding things, and sometimes it doesn't translate perfectly on a one-to-one ratio. Things might be different from the way that we think that they would be, defining by English terms. Does that make sense? And so when God pardons them, what's He pardoning them from? What do they deserve in the moment?
Immediate death.
Immediate death. That God says, I'm going to wipe them all out, Moses. I'm going to start with you. Moses says, don't do that. And He says, okay. Then I'm not going to give them what they deserve. And what they deserve is immediate death. I will pardon them from what they deserve, and they're going to have this mitigated punishment instead. One in which they continue to live, some of them maybe even for another 40 years. And they're going to go in the wilderness for 40 years until this entire generation has died out. Which means that they will continue to be there to help mold, influence, take care of their children, their children's children, their children's children's children, to help them to see the mistakes that they've made, the things they've done wrong. They have now time that they can continue to influence those generations. But what does he say here? And that's part of it, isn't it? When he says that God is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, he forgives iniquity and transgression, but he doesn't necessarily clear the guilty, but he visits the iniquity of what? Yeah, well, that doesn't sound right. He visits the iniquity. That's a weird phrase. How many of you guys talk like that, right? What does that mean? He visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third, the fourth generation. What does that phrase mean? It means they pay for their sins, right? This generation's sins continues from generation to generation to generation. Well, that doesn't sound right, does it? Doesn't Ezekiel very clearly tell us that God only punishes that one generation? That a man, sins for his sins, and then his son's punished for his sins, right? What do you guys make of this? Yeah, Kelly?
The fallout from a sin can affect your children and your grandchildren, even though they didn't sin. The choice that you made can affect them, and as the consequence, but also it changes the way people think about who they are. It can change the way people think about who they are and how they're supposed to act based upon what Grandpa was.
Yeah.
And who Grandpa was.
Yeah.
Whether that's... Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, they're going to wander for how many years? 40 years, which means that you have the Exodus generation, right? Are they going to be punished? Aren't they the ones receiving the punishment? The Exodus generation. But who else is going to wander for 40 years? Or at least a bit of that 40-year time period. Their children, right? The children's children. And is it conceivable their children's 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 children? I may have added one too many, but you get the point, right? Is it conceivable that you're going to have down to the third, even the fourth generations, there's going to be people who are going to be born wandering around in this wilderness? Are they going to be suffering the consequences of the sin of that Exodus generation? Yes. Absolutely. They're suffering the consequences. Do they bear the guilt of the Exodus generation? No, the guilt resides right here. But the consequences last from generation to generation to generation, even to the third or fourth generation. But if you go back to Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, what is the third and fourth generation compared to? You have a real juxtaposition between the third and the fourth generation who receive the iniquity, right? It visits the results, the consequences. But that's compared to what? He will keep his loyal love, his steadfast love, his covenantal love, however you want to translate that word there. It extends to how many? No, the iniquity comes to the third or fourth generation. The hesed goes to the thousands. And I think thousands is supposed to be in comparison to generation. It's the thousands of generations. Iniquity, when they're punished, punishment's going to last for 3 or 4 generations. It will. And that's a long time, but it's nothing compared to God's loyalty that he has to his covenant and his covenant people, and the love that extends beyond those 3 and 4 and goes to thousands more. And he says, yeah, iniquity is going to be visited upon them. Punishment's going to be made. Consequences of here are going to extend to these further generations, but God does not leave them. And his love is up here and continues down through here, through the thousands of generations. Can you see that contrast? God is not leaving them. He is not forsaking them. And so he tells them all of this and gives them, he pardons them from what they should have received. He gives them a mitigated punishment, basically their free will choice, as Kelly was talking about. They get what they asked for. It's going to affect the multiple generations, but it's going to extend. Israel, God's people, they will extend well beyond Numbers chapter 14, will they not? Is their story over at this point? No. Because God's love, his covenant, his chesed, his there's not a good word, by the way, to translate this. The translations are all over the place, but it's one of the most important words in the Old Testament. So you would think that they would have come up with a really good translation, but it's just a kind of loyalty, unending, just tenacious loyalty to the covenant and love that's expressed, that's going to continue on throughout, leading them all the way through, we see, into the New Testament. So what we find from this point, Kelly already talked about it, the very first thing that they do when this is announced, what do they decide? Yeah, they're like, all right, you know what, we messed up, mulligan, we'll take a mulligan here, we'll do it now. Let's go. Are you armies all ready to go? Yeah, we're ready. And Moses is like, guys, don't go. He made his decision. He is not going to go with you into this battle. And whereas before Moses told them that if they go into battle, before, and now at the early point, if they go into battle, would they have won? Yes. Absolutely. No problem at all, because God is with them. Now he says God's not going to go with you, and what will happen? You will lose. And they go anyway. They fight against the Amalekites, and what happens? They lose. And you have the first deaths that take place in the 40 years of wandering. During this time, you have various things that take place. We really have very little about that 40-year time period. It's just not given a whole lot of attention. Just highlights during this time period. You have Korah's rebellion, and then all of the fights, I guess, that you have for leadership that take place. You have the people are dying in chapter 20. Miriam dies. Chapter 20 is when Moses strikes the rock, which that's what he did before, right? God told him, when they were on their way to Sinai back in Exodus, and God said, strike a rock and water will come out. Here he tells Moses to speak to a rock, but instead, what does Moses do? Yeah, and is that why he was punished so much? Because he took a stick and hit a rock? What was the problem? Anybody remember? Yeah, he stands up and says, okay, God and I are getting pretty tired of you people. And how long are you going to keep messing with us? And God's like, Moses, it's not us. All right? You are not me. You should have given all the glory here. And instead, you have elevated yourself to a position that is up here, and you have acted not upon what I've said, but upon yourself, taking my own authority upon you. And by so doing, he has voided his place as leadership among these people, this people. So in chapter 20, you also have the death of Aaron, all of this as they are trying to now, at the end of the 40-year time period, they've wandered around, we have no idea where. They end up again at Kadesh Barnea at the end of the 40-year time period, and they start working their way around here. They come up with problems with Edom around in here, and then Moab up in here. Ammon is up in this area. So as they are coming around, Edom doesn't even let them pass. They have to kind of go around Edom. They come into Moab, and they come up here to what's called the Plains of Moab. And it's here that Moses provides, really you could say it's a series of addresses. I think it's about 5 of them. And he addresses the people. What do we call this? We have it recorded. What do we call it? Deuteronomy. What does the word Deuteronomy mean? Okay, second law, right? So the word Deuteronomy means second law. Is this a second law that they're being given? Why do they call it second law? All right. Well, it's the second time that the law has been given to them. Why do they need to give the law now? Because there's a lot of repeats, plus some extra that's not found before. Why do you have to have a second giving of the law? It's a brand new generation of people. They weren't at Mount Sinai. They weren't there. Very few of them have made it all the way up here who were right here in the very beginning. And now as they are about to enter into the land, you're going to have other laws that are going to be added in to this Deuteronomy, this second telling of the law, such as the law of the king in Deuteronomy Chapter 17, and also in Deuteronomy Chapter 18, where Moses says that God's going to raise up a prophet like me, another one to come. Various things that are new material that they need to know and they need to understand as they are about to enter into the land. And so he gives these addresses, and the same way that Leviticus ends, Deuteronomy is going to end with what proclamations? Not fully end, but towards the end. They're read on the mountains, or it's supposed to have been read on the mountains. Mount Ebal and Gerizim. Anybody remember what they are? The blessings and the curses, where God says, look, it's really this simple. If you will abide by this law, I will bless you. And I will curse your enemies, and you will do great. You'll be a beacon of light for the world. But if you don't abide by this law, these are the curses that are going to come upon you. All those things that I said I would bring on your enemies, they're going to come upon you instead. This is the choice that you make. And then Moses has a song there towards the end in which he says, God is great, God is magnificent, God is awesome, and you will not be. You are going to fail, and God is going to bring in these judgments against you. And it's almost like the national anthem for them was, you are going to fail. That's kind of the way that it ends. And that's how Deuteronomy comes to its close. Remember, Moses is not allowed to go into the land. Instead, he's allowed to go up onto a mountain that's presumed to be about right here, Mount Nebo, and he's allowed to look into the land and see the land. But he's not allowed to actually go into it. And that ends Deuteronomy with the telling of the death of Moses. By the way, who wrote Deuteronomy? Moses. All right. Put those together. The end of Deuteronomy talks about what? The death of Moses. And who wrote it? Moses. So does Moses recount the story of his own death? What?
Or does he foretell it?
No, it's told after the fact.
So who wrote it?
Yeah. Did he get in trouble? Is that what happened? Huh? Oh, okay. All right. I just heard you say Joshua. Sorry. That was a joke. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Jason. Yeah. Here's the thing. There's obviously an editor. There's a redactor of some sort. There is somebody who took these writings and who went through, added things that needed to be added, put things in, like when in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3 where it says, now Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth. I don't think Moses wrote that. I really don't. I think somebody added that in because the most humble man on the face of the earth would not write that he was the most humble man on the face of the earth, right? Is that a problem? That this is Moses writing and yet some of the words in there are not Moses's and we may not know the difference one from the other? Is that an issue? It shouldn't be. What's inspired is not necessarily the words that Moses put on the page or, can't think of the word, carcass that's turned into a writing pad of some sort, or a stone or anything else. It's the final product that the Holy Spirit has given to us. And that final product may come through editors. It may come through other people. It may come through scribes who are taking this and putting it into a certain package. And you know what? That's okay. That's not a problem. And other people will try to make it a problem where it doesn't need to be a problem. It's okay. The Holy Spirit is able to guide editors the same way that he can guide Moses, right? What we want is the finished product. That's what's important. And if it takes an editor to make that finished product, I have no problem. Maybe it's Joshua, maybe it's Nehemiah or somebody in Nehemiah's time. Whatever the case is, this is the finished product that we have. And that brings us then through the Pentateuch not next week, because we will be gone next week, 2 weeks from now. We will begin in Joshua and look at the conquest of the land. All right, thanks a lot, guys.